slightly. It's now going to be armour in Henry V. Just one play, I think it's more than enough. And in fact, I think it's perfectly apt 1 week before the 600th anniversary of this disastrous French defeat of Agincourt for the English. So Henry V has remained in collective memory as the victor of Agincourt, the warrior king whose short-lived reign coincided with the moment of greatest expansion for England across the Channel. He was popularized as a king in armor, here in a 19th century French edition, especially thanks to Shakespeare's play Henry V, which was written in 1599. The play stages his victorious campaign from the siege of Armour to the treatise of Troyes. So here a few incarnation, if you like, embodiment of the king on screen. Hiddleston. Here, Tom Hiddleston in the BBC Hollow Crown series in 2012, and here a 19th century portrait of Henry V, and here, of course, Laurence Olivier. All right, so I'd like to take the opportunity of the anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt to focus on the use of armour in the play. As a paean to the English nation and a celebration of its heroic king, the play has acquired a peculiar status in British culture. Written in the wake of the sounding victory against the Spanish Armada at a time when history was a fashionable subject on the English stage, it's a patriotic text which Trevor Nunn, the director Trevor Nunn, calls the national anthem in 5 acts. One in which the English, in unison with representatives of the other nations of the British Isles, Welsh, Scottish and Irish soldiers, cut a dashing figure against the French, reduced to a gallery of grotesque characters. Needless to say, the play has not been a favourite of Shakespeare's in France. As a celebration of a military campaign which resulted in Henry V's consolidation of his power and in the resolution of his aggressive claim over the crown of France, it was repeatedly performed at key moments of English history. In his 1944 filmed version, Laurence Olivier, for instance, turned it into a wartime propaganda piece. Yet, Henry V is not exactly represented as the heroic warlord that one could expect from this legendary status he was later to acquire. In the chorus of Act 5, which closely follows Shakespeare's Saul's Holinshed, Henry's entry into the city of London is not that of a glorious hero returning victorious from his military campaign. As told by the chorus, Henry refuses to be hailed as a hero altogether and turns down his lord's suggestion that his bruised helmet and his bended sword be publicly displayed as emblem of his exploits. I quote, "You may imagine him upon Blackheath, where that his lords desire him to have borne his bruised helmet and his bended sword before him through the city. And he forbids it, being free from vainness and self-glorious pride, giving full trophy, signal, and ostent quite from himself to God." To understand the implications of this, perhaps we should look at what other leaders might have worn in similar circumstances closer to Shakespeare's time. Henry VIII, for instance, I'm going to show some pictures that we've already seen, in fact. Henry VIII, for instance, possessed several suits of field and parade armour, but ceremonial armour was also, as we saw in the previous talk, was also extremely fashionable among the aristocracy at the time when Shakespeare was writing, which represented the peak of the Greenwich School. We cannot expect, of course, Shakespeare to be a historian of weaponry, but the bruised helmet and bended sword are perhaps more like the only weapons that we know actually belonged to Henry V. Simple, light, functional. Apt also for a 15th century king rather than a 16th century aristocrat, but also apt for a Christian king who clearly refuses pomp and who, according to sources, but not Shakespeare, even forbid his people from celebrating his victory in ballads. This scene, as critics have noted, or this rather anti-spectacular spectacular of the king refusing to be shown as a hero. So this scene, as critics have noted, is reminiscent of a similar one in Coriolanus, in which the victorious warrior Coriolanus refuses to display the wounds he's incurred in the service of Rome to gain the people's suffrages. But the resemblances are only superficial, I think. The character's motivations are in fact antithetical. Where Coriolanus cannot abase himself to solicit the people's votes, Henry V displays his denial of ostentation and vanity by refusing to wield his used field weapons as trophies. The militarist parade is thus turned into a Christian show of humility. As I hope to be able to show, martial chivalric heroism is displaced in this play by a Machiavellian strategy of self-presentation. So I will try and analyze this apparent paradox of anti-heroic heroism by looking at how weapons and armor are used in Henry V as ambiguous props to define different versions of heroism or lack thereof. Their final absence in a play that is so full of them heralds, I think, a new conception of kingship embodied by a Machiavellian ruler manipulating appearances as ostens or signals. First remark, perhaps, a banal one. Weapons and armor are first, of course, props on the stage. As Susan Harlan has shown about Pericles' rusty armor, they were usually recycled pieces, which might explain their sometimes decrepit state. Weapons and armor could also be fake, of course, made out of wood or lath, boiled leather, or even papier-mâché. It's clear that Shakespeare and his contemporary playwrights used pieces of armor to suggest a full military gear when needed. We learn from the exhibition Chevalier et Bombarde that a suit of armor in the 16th century was composed of between 16 and 20 pieces, which took about 4 minutes to be secured on a man's body with practice. It weighed between 15 kilos in the 15th century and around 30 kilos sometimes in the 16th century. In his prologue to the play, Shakespeare famously theorized on the collaborative leap of imagination necessary for the spectator to imagine the complete armor on stage with the help of just a few props and actors as visual aids. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casques that did affright the air at Agincourt? And let us, ciphers to this greater Canton, your imaginary forces work. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. Imagination here is described as relying on metonymy, or rather synecdoche, the part for the whole, the casques or helmets for the armor, one soldier for the whole army. Although Shakespeare can sometimes rely on the spectacular for dramatic effect, for instance, when he describes old Hamlet as appearing as warlike, I quote, this fair and warlike form in which the majesty of buried Denmark did sometimes mark, so, which implies that he's in full armor. He more often relies on the piece for the whole, on the casques for the fully equipped armies. This reflection on imagination is emblematized in the play through the image of imagination as a forge, which internalizes weaponry. When the chorus in Act 5 appeals once more to the spectator's imagination to conjure up the king's entry into London, it's said, "Now behold, quick forge and working house of thought, how London doth pour out her citizens." Wonderful internalization of weaponry. And with us left to imagine the armourers accomplishing the knights with busy hammers closing rivets up, give dreadful note of preparation. That's the chorus of Act 4. I'm told by Juliette that would have been completely impossible. That basically you don't rivet up the armor on the body, otherwise it's like a box you can't get out of. Anyway, Shakespeare as well. Again, Shakespeare is not a historian. Shakespeare deftly plays on all the degrees of presence of armor in Henry V. Armor, of course, is first used to define two antagonistic culture, two national identities. The magnificence of the French lord's armour, which we know must be etched and gilded since there are references to their shine and ornamentation, reflects vanity. Armour and horses are objects of hyperbolic rivalry among them on the eve of the battle. All of Act 3, Scene 7 is occupied by their quarrel. The Lord Constable boasts about his suit of armour as, I quote, the best armour in the world. Orléans about his horse as the best horse of Europe. But Bourbon denies their superiority, first praising his own horse in an extravagant manner, and then mocking the over-elaborate decoration of the constable's suit of armour. I would like to thank Sophie for reminding me of that wonderful Cumberland portrait by Hilliard, which represents the armour with suns and stars and moons, because in fact, the constable's armour is precisely described by Bourbon as having too many suns and stars. So I'm pretty sure that this is what Shakespeare had in mind, not this one, but the Cumberland one, which we just saw when he when he satirized the French in this scene. So as we know, however, the French cavalry was almost entirely decimated in the Battle of Agincourt. The English, who were by far outnumbered, probably in a proportion of 1 to 2 in the latest estimates, although Shakespeare follows his sources in saying 1 to 5, used a fatal combination of elite archers with the famous long bows and sharp staves planted in the ground to prevent the advance of horses, to be finally finished off by footmen armed with pikes and swords. The French cavalry predictably charged towards the longbowmen, which was a disaster, as we know. That Shakespeare should focus on the French pride in their beautiful armour and horses is therefore highly ironic. Agincourt was a battle that showed that wars would from then on be fought by footmen and with the recourse to long-range weapons, such here as longbows, later firearms. The French knights represents, therefore, an old-fashioned form of chivalric warfare, whose days were numbered. Conversely, Henry, with his disrespect for old-style conventional warfare, appears as a modern warlord, as critics have noted. He disregards the chivalric usage of discussing ransoms before the battle. He shows his appreciation and concern for his footmen and common soldiers by scouring the camp before the battle. And of course, this stands in sharp contrast with the French emphasis on class distinction. The only part of the French army that we get to see is the aristocratic cavalry. And significantly, after the battle, the French insist on sorting their dead to extract the noblemen who, I quote, lie drowned and soaked in mercenary blood from the vulgar. Finally, Henry V departs from the chivalric ethos, most obviously by having all his prisoners killed in the middle of the battle, a fact which Shakespeare borrows from Holinshed, but without excusing Henry. In fact, he also draws the spectator's attention to Henry's cruelty when showing him threatening to destroy France if he cannot conquer it. France being ours, will bend it to our oar or break it all to pieces. The dapper appearance of the French is used in contrast, as a contrast for the English army, repeatedly described as ragged and exhausted, a ruined band, a beggared host, as Grandpré calls them contemptuously. A historical fact again, but highlighted repeatedly by Shakespeare. The French gloat over the imminent victory, describing the English banners as ragged curtains and mocking the rusty beavers of the soldiers. The horsemen are even more graphically described as pathetic fixed candlesticks, whose poor jades stand motionless with their heads drooping. Henry V himself comments, "Our gayness and our guilt are all besmirched with rainy marching in the painful field. There's not a piece of feather in our host." Remember what we said about the feathers of the Elizabethan armour earlier. And you can contrast this with the trimmings of the French in the play itself. But this lack of lustre becomes, of course, a virtue. It stands for solid modesty and valour against the frills and vanity of the French. Rather than a beautiful armor, the English have a steeled heart. The image of the armor is interiorized and suggests superior courage, inspired by divine grace. O God of battles, steel my soldiers' hearts. What the French see as a ruined band, Henry celebrates as a band of brothers in his famous patriotic speech on the eve of the battle. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. For Henry is defined as a born warrior. He's warlike Harry in the prologue. Yet the play is not exactly about his jest, although he does take part in the action. Heroism on the field is reserved to the brave generals, those who in the vanguard have chosen sacrifice, like the Duke of York, for instance, whose armour is symbolically described as an armour of blood, and who dies a martyr for the cause. From helmet to spur, all blood he was. Henry is not singled out for his exploit on the field, which is perhaps appropriate for his egalitarian idea about a band of brothers, but at the end of the play, he admits to his future wife, the French princess, that he's still a plain soldier. Take a king. The shift from wartime to peacetime and from war to diplomacy and to love does not come easy to the man with an aspect of iron, as he calls himself, who was meant to be a soldier even before his birth. Beshrew my father's ambition. He was thinking of civil wars when he got me. Therefore was I created with an aspect of iron. As the valiant scion of a dynasty of soldiers is unfamiliar with the sophisticated and refined uses of the court. He thus bluntly tells his wife he expects her to give him a soldier for a son. Thou must needs prove a good soldier breeder. Act 5, Scene 2. Henry, uncomfortable with the rhetoric of the lover, however, and with a poor command of French, is mocked by the young princess. The conqueror will have to learn the art of courtship. The lady will not be assayed like an enemy's citadel. In fact, she's explicitly exchanged in marriage for a series of French cities at the end of the scene, which suggests graphically, I think, that diplomacy and princely alliance are a continuation of war through other means. So, to conclude on this point, in spite of his warrior king, Shakespeare is not interested in military strategy. We don't get a sense of how the battle is fought. The issue of the day remains confused, even to Henry V, who has to wait for the enemy to acknowledge defeat in Act 4, Scene 7. Surprisingly, perhaps, Shakespeare nowhere mentions the presence of archers. We hear about pikes, swords, but the famous longbows do not feature, although they famously played a decisive role in the battle, with their speed and range of fire and the number of casualties caused by their deadly arrowheads capable of piercing armour. This is from the exhibition Chevaliers et Bombards. That's the English soldiers' garb. And these are the terrible, the traumatic arrowheads. It seems clear that Shakespeare is much more interested in the making of a king and in his ambivalent personality than in military strategy. This sheds light, I think, on Henry's London entry, his London entry in the chorus of Act 5. At key moments in the play, Henry places, in fact, his exploits on the battlefield in a providential perspective, turning the campaign into a judgment of God in a form of metaphysical wager. Let us deliver our puissance into the hand of God, Act 2, Scene 2. We are in God's hands, brother, not in our enemies, Act 3, Scene 6. In Henry IV, Part 2, Shakespeare had shown the first step of Henry V's coming of age by staging his conversion from riotous youth to virtuous prince. In Henry V, the young king is shown consolidating his power, conscious, as in a prayer before the battle, that his realm is tainted by his father's sin of usurpation. He prays for his Christian contrition to be met with divine grace and pardon. I, Richard's body, have interred new, and on it I've bestowed more contrite tears than from it issued forced drops of blood. More will I do. In this metaphysical wager, it's clear that victory becomes a sign of his election and of God's grace, the divine sanction for his realm. But this election must be staged for the benefit of the public, for it to be politically efficient. On the eve of the battle, Henry V makes a discovery which he will remember. Wandering about the camp, he discovers that without his crown and coat of arms, there's nothing to distinguish him from the common man. Contrary to Richard II, for instance, who was convinced of his kingly aura by virtue of his legitimacy as a king by divine right, Henry V cannot rely on the mystique of the king's two bodies. Dressed as a simple gentleman among his men, he is exposed to the insolence of Private Williams. "But your Majesty came not like yourself. You appeared to me as a common man," Williams will later say. This leads Henry to reflect on what makes a king. What have kings that privates have not to, save ceremony, save general ceremony, idle ceremony? It is a lesson in humility, the demonstration that apparel, respect, and rituals of state are key, since real nobility does not show through. Be sick, greatness. This he seems to remember when staging his entry into London as a public ritual, in a conscious strategy of self-presentation, perhaps learned out of Machiavelli. By discarding his armour and weapons, and by refusing to be hailed as the victor of Agincourt, Henry V ostentatiously staging his renunciation to war and to his status as a war leader, which he has transcended. He signifies that he's no longer a warlord, a general among others, even the best, primus inter pares, their conquering Caesars, but a Christian king whose realm is sanctified by divine grace. It represents the royal actor's refusal of the pomp that goes with the triumphs of the Roman general. And it must be read in the context of the contemporary discourse against vanity of vanities. Henry solemnly declared himself free from vainness and self-glorious pride. The parts of the armour that are discarded symbolically form an effigy of the king, who functions, c'est une effigie en creux, it's hollow, it doesn't appear, it's not there, it's missing. So an effigy of the king which functions in the speech as a symbolic projection of his former self. A body of an earthly warrior treated as a body of vanity, which reminds us, of course, of the discarded pieces of armour in Vanitas painting of the 17th century, which itself takes its source perhaps in the old tradition of the dance of death, here in Holbein's version. But I like to suggest that Henry creates his own personal doctrine of the king's two bodies in this particular scene. Not a mystical union of a divine and a natural body, but the sloughing of one state of himself into another. The discarded armour functioned as the envelope of his former self, as he sheds his identity as a mere soldier to assume the body of a king. Thank you. I have to stop there.